James Wilson sat nervously in his first-class seat on the morning flight to London. The smooth leather felt strange against his palms as he gripped the armrests. His walking cane rested beside him, carefully placed between his seat and the window. Under his simple grey trousers, his prosthetic leg remained hidden from view, though it sometimes made sitting for long periods uncomfortable. At 45 years old, James had come a long way from his childhood in the small town of Millfield. After losing his leg in a car accident 12 years ago, he had faced countless obstacles. People looked at him differently, some with pity, others with discomfort. But James had always been determined not to let his disability define him. Last year, when Millfield Airways was about to shut down, James stepped in. The airline had been part of the town's identity for over 50 years, employing hundreds of local people. Using the money he had made from his technology business, James bought the struggling company. He wanted to save those jobs and keep the airline spirit alive. Today was special. For the first time since becoming owner, James was flying as a regular passenger. He wore no fancy suit, no company badge, just jeans, a blue jumper, and comfortable shoes. He wanted to experience the real service, to see how passengers were treated when no one was watching. This way, I can see what really needs fixing, he had told his friend Oliver last night. No special treatment, just the truth. The other passengers filed onto the plane, placing bags in overhead bins and settling into their seats. A businessman in an expensive suit sat across the aisle, immediately putting on headphones. An elderly couple took their seats in front of James, the woman helping her husband with his seatbelt. James watched it all, making mental notes. So far, everything seemed normal. The plane was clean, the boarding efficient. He relaxed a little, thinking this might be a pleasant surprise. Then he heard it, a sharp voice cutting through the gentle hum of conversation. "Excuse me," the voice said. "I think you're in the wrong section." James looked up to see a flight attendant standing over him. Her name badge read Emma. She was perhaps in her mid-30s, with blonde hair pulled back tightly and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I have my boarding pass right here," James said politely, pulling the ticket from his pocket and showing it to her. Seat 3A, first class, exactly where he was sitting. Emma barely glanced at the ticket. Her eyes moved from James's casual clothes to his walking cane, then back to his face. Her lips tightened. "This must be a mistake," she said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "First class is usually for different types of passengers." The businessman across the aisle lowered his headphones slightly, watching the scene unfold. The elderly couple turned in their seats. James felt a familiar knot in his stomach, the same feeling he got whenever someone judged him before knowing him. But he had learned to stay calm in these moments. "There's no mistake," he said firmly, but without raising his voice. "This is my seat, the ticket is correct." He saw something flash in Emma's eyes, anger perhaps, or embarrassment at being challenged. Her cheeks flushed red. "Sir," she said, emphasizing the word in a way that made it sound like an insult, "perhaps you misunderstood the boarding procedure. This section is for premium passengers." James understood what she was implying, that he didn't look wealthy enough, that with his disability and casual clothes, he couldn't possibly belong in first class. "I understand perfectly," he replied. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." By now, several other passengers were watching. A second flight attendant, a young man with kind eyes, hovered uncertainly at the end of the aisle, sensing the tension. Emma's face grew redder. Her hands clenched at her sides. "You need to lower your voice," she snapped. Though James had been speaking quietly. "I'm not raising my voice," James said calmly. "I'm simply explaining that this is my seat." What happened next shocked everyone. Who saw it? Without warning, Emma's hand shot forward, connecting with James's cheek in a sharp slap that echoed through the cabin. "You will not speak to me like that," she hissed. A collective gasp rose from the watching passengers. The businessman dropped his headphones. The elderly woman covered her mouth in horror. For a moment, time seemed to stop. James sat perfectly still, one hand slowly rising to touch his burning cheek. He felt the sting of the slap, but even more, he felt the sting of humiliation. After all he had accomplished, after all the barriers he had overcome, to be treated this way, it cut deep. Emma seemed frozen too, perhaps just realizing what she had done. Her eyes widened, her hand still hovering in the air. James said nothing. The silence around them was deafening. What had been a normal morning flight had suddenly become something very different. And though no one on the plane knew it yet, that slap would change many lives forever. The silence that followed Emma's slap seemed to stretch forever. Passengers stared, some with their mouths open, others looking away in embarrassment. The elderly couple in front of James exchanged worried glances. The businessman across the aisle slowly removed his headphones, his eyes wide with shock. James kept his hand pressed against his cheek, feeling it grow warm and tender. In his 20 years of business travel, nothing like this had ever happened to him. His mind raced with thoughts, not of anger or revenge, but of the deeper problems this moment revealed about his airline. William, a young flight attendant with kind eyes and a neat uniform, rushed down the aisle. His face showed genuine horror at what he had just witnessed. "Emma, what have you done?" William's voice was hushed but intense. He turned to James, his professionalism taking over despite the unusual situation. "Sir, please let me get you some water and ice for your cheek." Before James could respond, Emma crossed her arms defensively. Her face was still flushed, but now with a mixture of anger and fear. "This man doesn't belong here," she insisted, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "He must have snuck in during boarding. Look at him." Several passengers murmured in disapproval at her words. An older gentleman 2 rows back called out, "That's enough, miss." William returned quickly with a glass of water and a napkin-wrapped ice pack. He handed them to James with a look of deep concern. "Let me see your ticket again, sir," William said gently. James handed over his boarding pass. William studied it carefully, then looked back at Emma with disbelief. "Sir, I am terribly sorry. Your ticket is perfectly valid." He turned to Emma. "This gentleman is exactly where he should be." Emma's lips tightened, but she said nothing more. The tension in the cabin remained thick enough to touch. A message went out over the plane's communication system, and minutes later, the captain himself appeared from the cockpit. Captain Thomas Baker was a tall man with grey at his temples and the confident bearing of someone who had been flying for decades. "I understand there's been an incident," Captain Baker said, his voice low as he surveyed the scene. His eyes lingered on James's reddened cheek. William explained what had happened while Emma stood silently, her eyes now fixed on the floor. The captain's expression grew increasingly grave. "Sir," Captain Baker addressed James directly, "on behalf of Millfield Airways, I want to apologize profusely for this completely unacceptable behavior. Would you like us to remove this staff member from the flight before we take off?" James thought carefully. A part of him, the part that still stung from the slap and the humiliation, wanted to say yes. But the businessman in him, the owner who cared about every aspect of his airline, had other ideas. "No," James said finally. "That would only delay the flight for everyone. Just make sure this is properly documented. I'll handle it after we land." Captain Baker nodded with respect. "As you wish, sir. We'll make sure the rest of your journey is comfortable." As the captain returned to the cockpit, Emma was quietly moved to the economy section, away from James. The pre-flight announcements resumed, and slowly, the normal rhythm of boarding continued. Throughout the 2-hour flight, James noticed how the other staff members treated him with extra care. William brought him premium meals before serving anyone else. Another attendant, Lucy, offered him magazines and checked if his cheek needed more ice. James accepted their kindness but kept watching, observing, making mental notes about the service, the procedures, the small details that most passengers might miss. Despite the pain on his face and the curious glances from other passengers, James maintained his dignity. He didn't complain or make demands. He simply watched and learned. As the flight neared its end, William paused beside James's seat during a quiet moment. "Sir," he said hesitantly, "if you don't mind me asking, why aren't you angry? Most people would be furious after what happened." James looked up at the young man. He saw genuine curiosity there and perhaps a desire to understand. "Because anger changes nothing," James replied thoughtfully. "It just burns you up inside, but actions, those can change everything." William nodded slowly, not fully understanding the depth behind James's words. or knowing just how much those actions would indeed change things in the days to come. The plane touched down at Manchester Airport with a gentle bump. Through the window, James saw the grey English sky and raindrops sliding down the glass. As passengers began collecting their belongings, he remained seated, watching the airport workers guide the aircraft to its final position at the gate. What caught his attention was not the routine airport activity, but something unusual: a small group of people standing just inside the terminal. They wore the navy blue uniforms of Millfield Airways, and even from this distance, James recognized Mary Roberts, his operations director, among them. They know, he thought to himself. His secret inspection had obviously been discovered. Perhaps William or Captain Baker had sent word ahead about the incident. James wasn't surprised. In a company like his, news traveled fast. The seatbelt sign turned off with a soft ping. Passengers stood and began pulling bags from the overhead bins. James waited, in no hurry to join the crowded aisle. His cheek still felt tender where Emma had slapped him. At the front of the plane, James spotted Emma. She had been kept busy in economy class for the remainder of the flight, but now she stood near the exit door, preparing to say goodbye to passengers. She had composed herself, her uniform straightened, her face showing no sign of the earlier conflict. As James watched, Emma leaned toward another flight attendant, Lucy, who had been kind to him during the flight. "Those executives are waiting at the gate," Emma whispered, just loud enough for James to hear as he approached. "They'll back me up, you'll see. That man was rude and out of place." Lucy looked uncomfortable but said nothing. James gathered his cane and small carry-on bag, moving slowly toward the exit. He had no desire to rush this moment. What would happen next would shape the future of his airline. He wanted to get it. "Right, thank you for flying with Millfield Airways," Emma said automatically as passengers filed past her, her eyes focused somewhere over their heads. When James approached, she stiffened, but maintained her professional smile. The last few passengers exited. James stepped into the jet bridge, feeling the cooler air from the terminal. Ahead, the group in navy uniforms waited just beyond the gate area. As James emerged into the terminal, Mary Roberts stepped forward, her hand outstretched in greeting. She was a capable woman in her 50s whom James had hired last year for her excellent track record in airline management. "Mr. Wilson," Mary exclaimed, genuine surprise in her voice. "We weren't expecting you on this flight." Behind him, James heard a sharp intake of breath. He turned slightly to see Emma, who had followed the last passengers into the terminal. Her professional smile had disappeared, replaced by a look of confusion. "Wilson?" Emma said faintly. "As in James Wilson." Mary nodded, her eyes moving between James and Emma with growing concern. "Yes, our CEO and owner." She turned back to James. "Is everything all right, sir?" "We received an unusual incident report from Captain Baker about 20 minutes ago. He didn't mention you were on board." The color drained from Emma's face. Her hands began to tremble slightly as the reality of what she had done sank in. Not only had she slapped a passenger, a serious offense on its own, but she had slapped the owner of the entire airline. Another executive James recognized as Richard Brooks, the head of customer service, stepped forward. "Sir, we've only gotten preliminary information. Something about an altercation with a staff member?" James nodded slowly. "That's right." He touched his cheek, still slightly red from Emma's slap. The group of executives looked at Emma, who seemed frozen in place. Her earlier confidence had vanished completely. She looked as though she might be sick. "Perhaps we should discuss this in private," Mary suggested, gesturing toward the terminal. "Yes," James agreed, leaning slightly on his cane. "We have some things to discuss, Mary." As the group prepared to leave, James turned to Emma, who stood rooted to the spot, her face ashen. In that moment, he saw not just fear for her job, but the crushing realization of how badly she had misjudged the situation, and him. "Miss Emma," James said quietly, his voice neither angry nor triumphant, "please join us in the office after you've completed your duties." Emma could only nod, her earlier words about executives backing her up now ringing hollow in her own ears. As James walked away with the management team, she remained behind, the weight of her actions pressing down on her like a physical force. Emma sat in the sterile conference room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The air felt heavy with unspoken judgment, and her heart raced as James, the owner of the airline, studied her with an unreadable expression. His presence was calm but commanding, and the weight of her actions pressed on her like a crushing force. "Do you know why I bought this airline?" James asked, his voice steady and measured. Emma shook her head, unable to meet his gaze. "No, sir," she mumbled, her voice trembling. James leaned back in his chair, his prosthetic leg barely visible, under the table. "I grew up in this town," he began, his tone softening slightly. 10 years ago I lost my leg in an accident. After that everything changed. People stopped seeing me for who I was. They saw the disability first. It defined me in their eyes, and I hated it." Emma glanced up, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. James continued, his gaze fixed on her. "Years later, when I became successful, things changed again. But this time, it wasn't because of my abilities or character. It was because of my wealth. People treated me differently because of the money." He leaned forward, placing the incident report on the table between them. Emma's stomach turned as her eyes darted to the words written there. It was her mistake, her failure, staring back at her in cold, unfeeling ink. The recommendation. "Here," James said, tapping the report, "is immediate dismissal. What you did was wrong, Emma. You humiliated a passenger and failed to uphold the values we strive for." Tears welled up in Emma's eyes. She had been dreading this moment ever since the incident. Her voice cracked as she tried to speak. "I understand. What I did was... it was unforgivable." James regarded her for a long moment, his expression softening ever so slightly. "Perhaps it was," he said, "but I also believe people can change." Emma's breath hitched. She looked up, confused and hopeful. "What do you mean?" "You have a choice," James said firmly. "You can resign, walk away and leave this behind. Or you can stay, complete our new training program on dignity and respect, and work in our department for passengers with special needs." Emma blinked, unable to process his words at first. "You're giving me a second chance?" James nodded. "Everyone deserves one," he said simply. "The question is, what will you do with it?" Emma's tears flowed freely now, but they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of gratitude and relief. She nodded quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll take the training. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." James offered her a small, approving smile. "Good," he said, "because what matters most is what we learn from our mistakes. This isn't just about you, Emma. It's about making this airline a place where everyone is treated with dignity and respect." James stepped onto the plane, feeling the familiar hum of the engines beneath his feet. It had been 6 months since the meeting with Emma, and now he was curious to see how far she had come. The cabin was bustling with activity as passengers settled into their seats, and James noticed the calm, organized way the crew worked. Standing near the aisle, Emma helped an elderly man with a walker find his seat. Her voice was warm and patient as she guided him gently. "Take your time, sir. If you need anything during the flight, just let me know," she said with a kind smile. "Thank you, young lady," the man replied, easing into his seat with her assistance. James watched from a few rows back. Emma's transformation was evident. She carried herself with quiet confidence, her movements purposeful and her interactions sincere. She treated every passenger the same, whether they were elderly, young, or someone with a disability. It was clear she had found her calling. As James approached his seat, Emma noticed him and greeted him with the same warmth she showed every other passenger. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Wilson," she said, her tone respectful and genuine. "Good to see you again, Emma," James replied. He paused to watch her as she moved down the aisle, checking on passengers and assisting where needed. Before sitting, James stopped by her side. "How are you finding your new role?" he asked. Emma straightened, her smile deepening. "It's changed my life," she said. "At first I thought this was just about fixing a mistake, but it's so much more. I see people differently now. I was so wrapped up in my own assumptions before I couldn't really see them. Now I do." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's what I hoped for," he said. "You've done well, Emma. Better than I expected." Emma looked down briefly, her gratitude clear in her voice. "Thank you for giving me the chance." As the plane began to taxi, James settled into his seat. He glanced around the cabin, observing the small but meaningful changes that had taken place in the airline. The seats had been redesigned to accommodate passengers with different needs, from wider aisles to special storage spaces for mobility aids. The in-flight announcements now included visual aids for those who were hard of hearing. Even the crew's training showed in their calm and considerate demeanor. James thought back to the day he decided to give Emma a second chance. It had been a gamble, but one he was willing to take. Forgiveness wasn't easy, but it had proven to be powerful. The ripple effects of that choice had extended beyond one person, transforming an entire company culture. As the plane soared above the clouds, James looked out the window at the endless expanse of blue and white. A simple act of compassion had started all this. Sometimes, he thought, our worst moments can lead to our greatest transformations. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, and James closed his eyes, letting a quiet sense of satisfaction wash over him. The world was far from perfect, but today it felt a little closer to what it could be. For the first time in days, Emma felt a glimmer of hope. It wouldn't be easy, she knew, but she was determined to prove that she could be better, not just for the company but for herself.